In today's video, we are going to talk about the United States of America and the 45 American men who held the title of President of the USA. So if you want to know the evolution of US political parties and which presidents came from each party, how did we come to swear the president in on January 20th, some surprising stuff about the Electoral College, and how to become president without a single Electoral College vote, various presidential firsts, how many US presidents owned slaves, and how many slaves did they own, why being tall comes in quite useful if you want to be the president. Keep watching. The USA declared its independence from Great Britain on July 4, 1776, as most of you will know, but achieving full independence took a few more years, the Revolutionary War ending in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which formally recognized the US as an independent nation. 4 years later, in 1787, the US Constitution was adopted, and the following year presidential elections were organized. The election began in December 1788, when electors were chosen, and voting continued all the way into January 1789. This was the first presidential election under the new US Constitution, and organizing it took time. For example, different states followed different timelines for appointing electors, which dragged the whole thing on. George Washington was unanimously elected by the Electoral College, but it took until April 30, 1789, for him to be inaugurated in New York City, which had been chosen as temporary capital. After a short stint in New York, Philadelphia then took over as temporary capital for the next 10 years between 1790 and 1800. This arrangement was part of a compromise in the Residence Act of 1790, which established that a new, permanent capital city is going to be built along the Potomac River, but then became Washington, D.C. At the time of Washington's inauguration, there were almost no countries in the world whose leader was called president, with most states headed by kings, queens, emperors, sultans, and so on. So while today having a presidential republic and a president is basically no big deal, the form of political organization that the US chose in the late 18th century was definitely a very innovative thing for the time. George Washington and John Adams were the only two people that became presidents before the White House was built, with Adams moving there on November 1, 1800, just a few months before the end of his term. The White House was still unfinished, with ongoing construction and some rooms incomplete, and Adams' wife, Abigail, apparently using the unfinished East Room to hang laundry due to the lack of space. Let's imagine for a brief second Melania Trump having to do that. Jumping to the future, I should also say that the White House was named the President's House or Executive Mansion, with Teddy Roosevelt officially naming it the White House in 1901. He ordered the words "The White House, Washington" to be engraved on official presidential stationery, making the name official. Back to the 1800s, when Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801, he became the first president to spend a full term living in the White House, and every president since then has lived in it. Except when the British burned it down on August 24, 1814, and President James Madison had to evacuate. Rebuilding it took 3 years, with James Monroe, the next president, then moving back in during 1817. Since we have so far mentioned the first 5 presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, we should also say that these are the presidents considered to be among the founding fathers of the USA. Monroe was younger and less involved in the drafting of the foundational documents, but he did fight in the Revolutionary War and played a significant role in early US diplomacy and policy, so we can see him as a transitional figure from the age of the founding fathers towards the next generation of US presidents. He's also the creator of the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said to the Brits, the French, and other Europeans, "Keep your greedy paws out of the Western Hemisphere." I guess this is also what China is now trying to say to the US about their neighborhood, so let's see how that is going to turn out in the coming years. Now let's talk about the slave situation. Out of the founding fathers, John Adams was the only one who didn't own slaves, both him and his wife Abigail being vocal about their disapproval of the institution. John Quincy Adams, his son and the 6th president, also strongly opposed slavery and became an outspoken abolitionist after his presidency. Overall, out of the first 18 presidents, 12 had owned slaves over their lifetimes, and 8 owned slaves during their presidencies, with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Zachary Taylor each owning upwards of 100 slaves. The US presidential elections have been held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November since 1845, when Congress passed the Presidential Election Day Act. The November timing was chosen because it aligned with the end of the harvest season, allowing rural voters to participate and avoided having people travel to vote later in the year when winter set in. Until 1933, the US did not inaugurate its president until March, leaving the old administration in charge for another 4 months after Election Day. The ratification of the 20th Amendment, at the peak of the Great Depression, allowed FDR to take over on January 20th rather than March 4th, shortening the transition to 11 weeks. It has stayed like this ever since. Out of the 45 individuals who served as president up to this day, only one, FDR, served 3 terms and a bit in office, having died early in his 4th term shortly before Nazi Germany capitulated. 13 presidents served 2 full terms, 7 1 full term and 1 partial term, usually because they took over a partial term from a deceased predecessor and were then re-elected. 13 presidents served 1 full term. Once Joe Biden completes his term, this will increase to 14, and 10 less than 1 full term. Only one, Grover Cleveland, served 2 terms that were some years apart. Everyone else who served more than 1 term did it on consecutive terms. In January 2025, Donald Trump will become the 2nd president ever with 2 non-consecutive terms. This also explains the weirdness about the way US presidents are labeled, Grover Cleveland being both president number 22 and 24, and Trump being number 45 and 47. By contrast, presidents serving consecutive terms only get 1 number. Obama is number 44, even though he got elected twice just like Trump, but his terms were one after the other. Until 1951, there were no official term limits for a US president, but there was the informal precedent set by George Washington, who refused to go on past 2 terms. Following FDR being elected 4 times, on February 27, 1951, the Congress passed the 22nd Amendment, introducing a 2-term limit, or a maximum of 10 years if the new president assumed the presidency mid-term and served less than 2 years in their predecessor's term. And the last-minute interesting statistic I read in The Economist while editing the video, Donald Trump was the first person to win a major party's nomination 3 times in a row since FDR. So when Washington started as president, there were no political parties, and he was elected unanimously, but during his administration, conflicts between those in favor of a strong federal government and those wanting more power devolved to the states led to the formation of the Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and the Democratic-Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. After Thomas Jefferson's election to president, the Democratic-Republican Party became dominant, but by 1828, factions within it led to a split into the Democratic and National Republican parties. The Whig Party then appeared in the 1830s, supporting the supremacy of Congress over the presidency, economic protectionism, and modernization. In 1854, the Republican Party was founded in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories, with Abraham Lincoln becoming the first Republican president. Overall, until 2024, the US had 19 Republican presidents, 16 Democrats, 4 Democratic Republicans, 4 Whigs, 1 Federalist, John Adams, and 1 National Unionist, Andrew Johnson. Johnson was originally a Democrat who joined Abraham Lincoln on a National Union ticket, which was a temporary coalition of Republicans and war Democrats created to appeal to pro-Union Democrats during the Civil War. Despite his National Union label, Johnson's policies and principles aligned more closely with those of the Democratic Party, and he returned to the Democrats after leaving office. John Quincy Adams was the first president to be photographed in 1843, albeit this is 14 years after having left the presidency. Calvin Coolidge was the first to do a radio broadcast on December 6, 1923, and Harry Truman the first to start regularly addressing the American people on TV from the White House.
The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Martin Van Buren was the first president born in the US after the Declaration of Independence, and JFK the first to be born in the 20th century. JFK was also the first Roman Catholic president. Joe Biden was the oldest president on Inauguration Day at 78, Teddy Roosevelt the youngest to assume office at 42, even though he was not elected, but succeeded following William McKinley's assassination, and JFK was the youngest elected president at 43. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest to leave office at 50, and Joe Biden will be the oldest at 82 when he completes the current term. In this chart, we can see the height of all US presidents in chronological order of their presidencies. Presidents above the average height get dark blue bars, the ones below get red bars, and the ones having the average height get a shade of gray. The shortest US president was James Madison at 5'4" or 163 centimeters, and the tallest Abraham Lincoln at 6'4" or 193 centimeters. Presidents seem to have grown taller over time, with the average height of the first 34 presidents up until Eisenhower having been 5'10" or 178 centimeters, and that of the next 12 since JFK, 6'1" or 185 centimeters. If we compare this to the average male height in the US of 5'9" or 175 centimeters, we have to walk back more than 100 years, all the way to William McKinley, president number 25, to find a president with a below average height. Overall, there were 32 presidents above the current height average, 11 below the average, most of them in the 19th century, when the average male height was also significantly lower, and then 2 presidents had the exact average height. One theory is that since TV pre-election debates started to be held, the taller candidate has had an edge over their opponent. There may be some truth to this, as in the 16 elections since 1960, the taller candidate won 11 times, including Trump's 2024 win, the shorter won 5 times, and 1 time we had a tie. Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were both 6'1" or 187 centimeters in the 2012 election. And one more presidential physical feature I want to share with you today. The heaviest president was number 27, William Howard Taft, who weighed around 340 pounds or 154 kilograms at his peak, and the story goes, even though likely embellished, that he got stuck in the White House bathtub and then had to have a larger one installed. So there you go. There were 4 presidents assassinated while in office: Abraham Lincoln in 1865, James A. Garfield in 1881, William McKinley in 1901, and JFK in 1963, and 4 other presidents who died in office of natural causes. A pretty creepy fact: 3 of the first 5 presidents died on July 4th, Independence Day, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both on July 4th, 1826, within hours of each other, and James Monroe 5 years later, on July 4th, 1831. Now, if we do some back-of-the-envelope, very unscientific calculations, it turns out that with 4 out of 45 presidents assassinated, this results in a presidential assassination probability of roughly 9%, which is 1,154 times higher than the average US homicide rate. The Electoral College was established with the signing of the US Constitution on September 17, 1787, and was devised by the Founding Fathers as a compromise between electing the president by a popular vote and election by Congress. The idea being that people should be able to have a say, but also states should have a say, including the less populous ones. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution gave each state a number of electors equal to its combined total of senators and representatives in Congress, which is also what we have in place today, with one exception that I'll come to shortly. The system was first used when electing George Washington, and he received all electoral votes in both of his elections, something that no other president has achieved since. In the original rules, electors cast 2 votes for the president, and then the candidate with the most votes became president, while the runner-up became vice president. So unsurprisingly, this didn't work very well, as basically you would have your main rival you fought with over the campaign as your VP, imagine Hillary as Trump's VP, or Trump as Biden's VP, so it was rather quickly modified by the 12th Amendment of 1804, which required the electors to cast separate votes for the president and the VP. After Alaska and Hawaii were admitted as states in 1959, the Electoral College reached 535 electors, proportional to the 100 senators, 2 senators for each state from the 50 states, plus the 435 representatives in the House. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes, which raised the total to 538 electors, which is the number we have today. And now, a few voting statistics. The highest number of Electoral College votes received by a candidate was 525 votes for Ronald Reagan in 1984, followed by FDR with 523 votes in 1936 and Richard Nixon with 520 votes in 1972. The highest number of popular votes ever received was, as I'm sure you know if you've been following the news for the past few years, in the 2020 election, when Biden got 81 million votes, with second and third place being Trump with 77 million and Kamala Harris with 75 million, both in 2024. There were 5 instances when the winner of the popular vote lost the general election, 3 in the 19th century, 1824, 1876, and 1888, and 2 in the past 24 years, George W. Bush versus Al Gore in 2000, and Trump versus Hillary in 2016. I don't know about you, but this was a surprise to me. I've heard the popular versus electoral vote debate being brought up a lot since 2016, and I always thought that the popular vote went the other way versus the electoral vote more often than this. It turns out though that in the last 34 elections and 136 years, we only had 2 instances of the popular and electoral college votes going opposite ways. Maybe something to explore further in future episodes. 3 US presidents were impeached by the House, Andrew Johnson in 1868 on charges related to his dismissal of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, which violated the Tenure of Office Act, acquitted by the Senate. Bill Clinton in 1998.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people.
Well, he later changed these statements a little, as you know, but in the end he was also acquitted by the Senate. And then the Donald, the only president impeached twice, once related to his dealings with Ukraine, and then in 2021 on charges of incitement of insurrection after the January 6th Capitol attack. Acquitted both times by the Senate. If you don't know, the way impeachment works is that the House impeaches with a simple majority of 50% plus one vote, and then the Senate judges and either convicts or acquits the president with a 2/3 majority required for a conviction. Let's now move on to presidential succession. There were 5 vice presidents who later got elected president, and 9 vice presidents who acceded to the presidency by succession. When President William Henry Harrison died in 1841, just 32 days into his term, it was the first time a sitting US president had died in office. This created uncertainty about the vice president's role upon a president's death. John Tyler, who was vice president at the time, set a significant precedent by declaring that he would assume the full powers and titles of the presidency rather than just serving in a temporary capacity. Tyler took the presidential oath of office, moved into the White House, and began exercising all presidential duties, insisting on being called president rather than an acting president. This decision, known as the Tyler precedent, established that the vice president would fully assume the office of the presidency, not just the powers, upon the president's death. Though controversial, Congress ultimately accepted Tyler's claim, and his precedent was later codified in the 25th Amendment in 1967, which clarified the line of presidential succession. Another interesting fact is that Gerald Ford was the only US president who was never elected as either vice president or president. He was a congressman when Nixon's VP Spiro Agnew resigned in 1973 due to charges of tax evasion and corruption. Under the 25th Amendment, which allows the president to nominate a new vice president in the event of a vacancy, Richard Nixon then appointed Ford as VP without him having been elected. And then, when 1 year later Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, due to the Watergate scandal, Ford became the 38th president of the United States without ever having received any electoral votes. The 45 presidents to date were born in 21 states, with 8 presidents having been born in Virginia. I had zero clue about this before, by the way. Let me know in the comments if you knew this. Followed by Ohio with 7 presidents having been born there, and New York with 5. Barack Obama is the only president born outside of the continental United States. There were 2 pairs of father-son presidents, John Adams, president number 2, and John Quincy Adams, number 6, and then George H.W. Bush, number 41, and George W. Bush, number 43. James Buchanan, the 15th president serving from 1857 to 1861, was the only president to have never married, remaining a lifelong bachelor. Grover Cleveland was also a bachelor when he entered the White House, though later married, being the only president who wed while in office. Everyone else was married. 3 presidents had no children, James Madison, James Polk, and James Buchanan, while George Washington had no biological children, but adopted the children of his wife, Martha. And there you have it, the 235 years of history of the US presidency, from the early days of George Washington's unanimous election, devoid of political parties, to the partisanship of recent election campaign. If I've missed anything or got something wrong in this statistics-heavy video, please don't hesitate to add it in the comments. Also, as a brand new channel, I'm very interested in your feedback about what you liked or you didn't like, what you would have changed in the video, and what topics would interest you for upcoming episodes. I hope you enjoyed this dive into US presidential history. If you did, please don't forget to give me a massive thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing for more content like this on planetary matters. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time!